Hey guys, welcome back to the second video of the day. I'm Christy. The dogs are in the house, so you may hear them. Steve is yelling because he has opinions on the case because he's been watching it every day with me. My daughter is here trying to control the chaos with the dogs, so just bear with me. That's all I'm asking. We're going to talk about Brian and Nicole Albert's testimony today. Like I've said in the past video, it's time to start paying attention to the details of the story. You're going to notice some inconsistencies are starting to happen. And I do my best to try to point those out to you and see if you're making the same connections that I am. We're trying to come into this as jurors, and if you see things differently or think something differently, pop off in the comments and let me know why you think that or what you're thinking, and maybe you can change my mind. But as it stands, I still don't feel like the Commonwealth has proven to me that Karen Reed murdered John O'Keefe. I don't know what time they think he died. I don't know what his manner of death was. I don't know if his injuries, I don't think they look consistent with being hit by a car, but I'm patiently, not so patiently, waiting to hear from experts that maybe can make some of this make sense. Maybe some of the useless information that I have acquired from the Commonwealth will come into play at some point, but we're just going to have to wait and see. So for now, let's jump in with Nicole Albert. If you're watching, go ahead and give this a thumbs up to boost it in the algorithm. I would appreciate it. And here we go with Nicole Albert. She's lived in Canton her whole life. Now she lives in Norwood. She's been there for a year because they sold their house after John O'Keefe was found on their front lawn. She's married to Brian Albert. She has a daughter, Caitlin, who's 28. Brian Jr., of course, he's 25. He lives with them. They have a son that is 23, and they have 20-year-old twins, a son who's in the Marines, and a daughter who's attending college. And apparently she works as a part-time lunch lady. January 29th was Brian Jr.'s birthday, as we all know, and he was going to spend his birthday with friends. There was the big snowstorm coming, so she told him to do something with his friends on Friday instead. On Thursday, Brian Albert flew to New York City for a fallen police officer's funeral, and then he rode home with Brian Higgins on Friday after the funeral to beat the storm. She went to the waterfall at 7:30 to 8 p.m., and her sister, Julie Albert, picked her up. Now that all checks with Julie's testimony. What doesn't check is this. She says that Caitlin and her boyfriend were already there at a table. Julie testified that Caitlin was at 34 Fairview and rode to the waterfall with her and Nicole. Is this important? I don't know, but it's a inconsistency. So there you go. She says they ordered food and drinks. Caitlin's boyfriend left after eating because he was going to plow in the middle of the night. Jen and Matt McCabe joined at 9 p.m.-ish with another couple. Jen is Nicole's younger sister. Chris Albert came in at 9 to 9:30. Brian Albert came in at 10. Brian Higgins came in at 10:30. And John O'Keefe and Karen Reed came in at 11. She said that she had met John O'Keefe once or twice before through her sister, Jen McCabe. Again, epicenter of the bullshit. She's connected to everyone and everything. She said that she had never met Karen Reed. She knew that John was a Boston police officer, but she doesn't think he ever worked with her husband, Brian. She had no interaction with Karen Reed that night. John and Karen had never been to her home before. She says that she told Jen McCabe to swing by after midnight if she wanted to say happy birthday to Brian Jr. He was turning 23. She didn't say it to anyone but Jen. And this will come up again and again and again. So she says she only said it to Jen. She, Brian Albert, and Caitlin Albert left a little before 12 a.m. Brian Albert drove them home to 34 Fairview. It was about a 5 to 7 minute drive. Brian Albert parked in the driveway on the left-hand side. Brian Jr., Julie Nagel, and Sarah Levinson, and Colin Albert were there. She says Colin was about to leave, that he had a ride coming to get him. She said they mainly used the side door, but she went in the front door to take her shoes off in the foyer. Brian Higgins came, and then she says, actually, he pulled up before they did. He was driving a Jeep, and he parked by the curb mailbox area, and then she says, or maybe it was the driveway. Jen and Matt McCabe arrived at 12:15-ish. Colin left before the McCabes got there. Everyone left by 2 a.m. Caitlin was the last to leave. Her boyfriend picked her up. Brian Higgins left first at 1:30-ish. Jen and Matt McCabe, Julie Nagel, and Sarah Levinson all left between 1:45 and 1:50. She said that she was the only one awake. She didn't hear or see anything unusual outside. John O'Keefe and Karen Reed never came in. She didn't even know they were coming. After Caitlin left at 2 a.m., she cleaned and went upstairs to bed. She said Brian Albert was awake watching TV, where she had just said she was the only one awake, but here we are. And she says that she was asleep by 2:30 a.m. January 29th, she says that she woke up between 6 and 6:30 a.m. with Jen McCabe came bursting into the room. Bursting into the room. Just remember that phrasing. Jen says he's out in the snow. We don't know if he's okay. She's confused. She's like, I thought something happened to one of my kids or one of Jen's kids because Jen was hysterical. So she asked her what was going on. And Jen told her what she had witnessed outside and finally said, John from the bar last night. She said, what's he doing out there? Because she didn't know they were supposed to be coming. Jen said, you need to get up. The police are here and they want to talk to you. So as she and Brian Albert were coming downstairs, Officer Link was walking into the house. She saw 2 police cruisers outside. Link came in and Matt McCabe showed up. Link, Brian Albert, Jen and Matt McCabe, and she sat at the table and talked for about 45 minutes, and then another officer came in as well. Brian Albert had called Brian Higgins, and he came over 15 to 20 minutes after the officers had left. They were done with Link at about 7:45 a.m. Carrie Roberts was calling Jen McCabe with updates about what was going on with John. She said that she saw Julie Albert pull into the driveway to put the donuts in the car for Brian Jr. That was at about 8 to 8:30. She told Brian to get Julie so that she could be made aware of what was happening. Julie and the others were at the house for 1 or 2 hours after Jen burst in. She talked to state troopers a couple days later at her home. No one that lives there went outside that day. When everyone's home, she said there's 4 cars parked in the driveway. Her Cadillac SUV, Brian Albert's work car, a Ford Explorer, and the kid's Ford Escape. She says she might have put her car in the garage on January 28th because the snow was coming, but she doesn't remember. Okay, on Cross, this time we had Elizabeth Little instead of Yannetti or Jackson. You could tell her and Nicole, yeah, she does not like Elizabeth Little. Not even a little bit. Okay, so she's talking to her about, is Brian Albert a fighter? At the bar, in one of my previous videos, I had talked about the sparring, practice fighting, whatever you want to call it, where they were kind of, with each other and grabbing each other and ducking down and what have you. She says that Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were just fooling around at the waterfall, not practice fighting. She said that Brian Albert is not a highly trained fighter. He has fighting experience from his time in the Marines, and he has boxing experience. The Marines and the Boston PD trained him in fighting and defensive tactics. And then we talk about Brian Albert's work car, which is what she called it. She didn't say what kind of car, she just said his work car. So his work car is actually a black Ford Edge. She's heard that a Ford Edge was being talked about in regards to the case, but says that's not why she didn't mention it on direct. Brian Higgins parked where? You're going to come to learn that Brian Higgins has a magical vehicle that apparently some people can see it and some people can't. It's a thing. She hasn't discussed her statement regarding where Brian Higgins was parked with anyone else, she said. Where was Colin? She says when she walked in, Colin was standing, getting ready to leave. Someone was picking him up. He said, "My ride's almost here." She didn't see a vehicle waiting outside for Colin when they pulled up, and she didn't see Colin leave, but she didn't see him again. Colin has, like an invisibility cloak, because I don't think anybody actually saw this kid leave. Now we're going to talk about Chloe. Chloe was the family pet. She refers to Chloe as it. I didn't like that, but it is what it is. She, every time when she's talking about the dog, she doesn't refer to it as her. She refers to it as it. So Chloe was a German Shepherd mix. They got her from a shelter in Texas. They had her 6 years in 2022. She was about 70 pounds. She says Chloe was fine with strangers, but didn't like other dogs. Chloe had a well-documented bite history with other dogs. In May of 2022, she got out of the yard and she was fighting with another dog. The owner of that dog tried to break up the fight and got injured by Chloe. A neighbor called the police, and 2 women were taken to the hospital after this whole dog fight. Chloe escaped the backyard a few times. They don't have Chloe anymore. They rehomed her. So I think it was asked, you got rid of her, and she took offense to that and said, no, we didn't get rid of her. We rehomed her in May of 2022. And she says that Chloe is in Vermont. On January 29th, Brian Higgins left first, then Matt and Jen McCabe with Julie Nagel and Sarah Levinson. The last to leave was Caitlin, and that was close to 2 a.m. On January 29th, she told Lank that Caitlin left at 12:15 a.m. She says she's always maintained that Caitlin was last to leave. Lank was talking to everyone all at one time. She said it was more of a conversation than an interview, and must have misconstrued what she said regarding Caitlin leaving, and she's not trying to protect her daughter. Now, you're going to notice a pattern as we go through the rest of people's testimony of things being misinterpreted, misconstrued, mistakes in reports, things not being written down, what have you. It's a lot. It's a lot. So either law enforcement really screwed up in their reports or somebody's lying. She has discussed the case at length with her family before her interviews with law enforcement. On February 3rd, 2022, this was the first time that she was interviewed by the Massachusetts State Police, Trooper Proctor, of course. She was getting big mad when she was questioned about this. She left out that Brian Jr. was home with his friends. She left out that Caitlin came home with her after the waterfall. She left out that Brian Jr. had 2 female friends at home when she arrived. She left out that Colin Albert was there. And she says she did that because she didn't consider Colin to be a part of the group that was there. She never mentioned Colin Albert to Trooper Proctor or Sergeant Lank because she didn't even think of him because he left as soon as she got there. January 29th, she got 2 calls from Jen McCabe, one at 6:07 for 9 seconds. It says it was answered on the Celebrate extraction of the phones. She got another call at 6:08 a.m. It also says answered for 7 seconds. She says she didn't answer any calls from her sister that morning. There was no voicemail from Jen McCabe on January 29th, 2022. So, I don't know. She had also made a comment that at the grand jury, she said that she couldn't specifically say where everyone was positioned around the table that night. She wasn't able to place Brian Albert or Brian Higgins at the table. She says that when she went in, she kind of started cleaning up and that she didn't know where they were, but they weren't gone that long. Later, it said that they were in the family room, which is kind of off the kitchen. He was showing Brian some pictures of the son that's in the Marines. Let's see. So they show this graphic, which I have included here, of the house, and they ask her to show where her bedroom windows are, and I've circled it there. They're the last 2 windows on the front corner of the house on the 2nd floor. She says that she didn't see flashing lights outside because her blinds were shut and the curtains were closed. She said that she didn't hear fire trucks or ambulance. The first thing she remembers on January 29th was Jen McCabe coming into her room between 6 and 6:30 a.m. Let's see. even after seeing her Celebrate report, she says she doesn't remember answering those calls, that it was only her and Brian Albert in the room. She has blankets in her house and was lying next to a first responder, but they didn't go outside. Under redirect, we find out that she apologized to the women that were injured by Chloe. She offered to pay any bills associated with that, and they decided it was best to rehome her because they didn't want it to happen again. And that's it for Nicole. So now we're going to move on to her husband, Brian. Now, this guy, he worked for the fugitive unit with the Boston PD. I've seen pictures of him working, and I've seen videos of him boxing. And I'll just say, this man, that's not what I saw. A lot of people have compared him to Mr. Rogers on the stand because of his little sweater, and I'm sure they told him, how to dress, and this kind of just makes him look like this, middle-aged, mild-mannered guy. It really covers up like how he's built, like his arms and stuff, but it is what it is, you guys. This is what we're working with. So this is Brian Albert. He lived in Canton for 45 years. Now he lives in Norwood. He's been there a year. He's married to Nicole for 29 years. They have all the same kids, obviously. He's the oldest of 7 siblings. He has 5 brothers and 1 sister, and he is now retired from the Boston PD fugitive unit, and he had been there for 30 years. So we start off, he's telling us he's in New York City for a funeral for the fallen police officer who was killed in the line of duty. He says that he flew there on Thursday with his friend and co-worker, Eddie Hernandez. He said thousands of police officers went to the funeral. His brother Kevin from the Canton PD was there, and Brian Higgins was there. He knew Brian Higgins through work for 10 to 15 years, and then he said the past few years they had worked on a closer basis and became better friends. His flight home was canceled, so he rode back with Brian Higgins, Eddie Hernandez, and his brother Kevin because the storm was coming. They went to the Charlestown PD to pick up his work car, a Ford Edge, and drove towards Canton. Now, apparently he had parked at this kind of like a satellite police department because it was closer to Boston Logan Airport. So they're driving towards Canton. He says that he met Brian Higgins at the hillside between 9 and 9:30. He had a drink and hung out for a while. Brian Higgins ate, but he didn't. And his wife Nicole had asked if he wanted to come by and see them at the waterfall. So apparently it is a 7-minute drive from the hillside to the waterfall. Brian Higgins stayed at the hillside. At Waterfall, he sees Nicole Albert, Caitlin Albert, Chris Albert, Julie Albert, Matt McCabe, Jen McCabe, and there was another couple at the table before he got there, friends of Matt and Jen. That would be the Kolakithas. 30 minutes later, Brian Higgins arrives. He invited him to come when they were at Hillside. And then 30 minutes after that, at 11, John and Karen arrived. So he says that he knew John O'Keefe, but not too well. He only met him twice prior to that night. He said he knew him to be a Boston cop. He knew of him and knew some things about him. He said there's upwards of 2,000 people in the Boston PD. He never worked directly with John O'Keefe. He knew that he worked at the sex offender registry unit. He said that he knew John to be a friend of Jen and Matt McCabe. He knew him to be a friend of Chris and Julie Albert. He knew him to be a friend of Kevin Albert. He had heard his name mentioned multiple times. He knew he had a, quote, horrible couple tragedies in his life. He knew that he had stepped up and decided to take care of his niece and nephew when they, quote, tragically lost their parents. He didn't know him well, but considered him to be a friend. He said their relationship was very, very good. They were cordial. He considered him to be someone he could hang out with and have a good time with. And he says that he met Karen Reed one time, 1 week prior to this night. He had met her at the hillside with John O'Keefe. Okay. So things start winding down at the waterfall a little before 12 a.m. He, Nicole Albert, and Caitlin Albert left first. He says that Brian Higgins left at that same time too. There was a conversation about going to D&E Pizza, misspelling. Chris was going to make pizzas if anybody was hungry, but it didn't happen. It was Brian Jr.'s 23rd birthday. They discussed if anyone wanted to go by the house and say happy birthday to him. So he's saying like it was discussed among the group. Whereas Nicole said she only said that to her sister Jen. Nicole Albert told Jen and Matt McCabe it was said in the group they were in, and to him it was an open invitation to everybody. Sorry. He knew Brian Higgins was coming by. He said that he had come to the twins' graduation party in summer of 2021. It was an outside cookout type thing, and that Brian hadn't been in his house before, except maybe at that event to go in and just use the bathroom. So he drove himself, Nicole, and Caitlin home. He said it was about a 5-minute drive. He says Brian Higgins got there first, and that Brian Higgins backed out of the driveway so Brian Albert could pull in. He said Brian Higgins was not driving the same vehicle they drove back from New York in, that he was driving his Jeep Wrangler with a plow on the front, and he says he plowed the driveway, which at first I didn't think much of it, but when I start going back over this stuff, people will say at that time when they get home like 12:30, there was just a dusting. Like it had just started snowing, just started to stick. So what would there have been to plow in the driveway? I don't know. It's just something I picked up on that I was like, that's a little weird. Why did he say that he plowed the driveway? I don't know. Anyway, he says that they have his Ford Explorer. They have Nicole's Cadillac SUV. Brian Albert also has his Ford Edge. And the kids have a Ford Escape. And they were in the driveway. He says they didn't use the garage for cars a lot. They mainly used it for storage. So when Nicole said maybe she put her car in the garage, I'm going to say she didn't, because he says it's in the driveway and that the garage is like, it sounds like it's kind of just a cluttered mess. Like you'd really have to clean it up to put the car in. and he wasn't there Thursday or Friday before now, so I doubt her car was in the garage. Anyway, Brian says that he parked on the left side of the driveway, which is the same as his wife testified, and he says he doesn't know where Brian Higgins parked. He went in the side door into the family room den area. He said Brian Jr., Julie Nagel, Sarah Levinson, and Colin Albert were there. He says Colin was standing in the kitchen. Brian Jr. and the girls were at the table. He said Colin was there for 5 minutes and he was getting picked up. He might have left before Jen and Matt McCabe got there, and he says no one else came into the house. And now he's going to talk to us about Chloe. Once again, she's a German Shepherd mix. He says they got her at a shelter in Dallas, Texas, which is a little more specific than Nicole got. Said they had her 6 or 7 years in 2022. He went upstairs to let Chloe out to go to the bathroom. He stayed at the door while Chloe went to the bathroom, and she came right back in. It took maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then he took Chloe back upstairs and put her in his room, because apparently Chloe sleeps in their room. He says Brian Higgins left at 1:30 in the morning. He said Brian Albert he went to his bedroom and watched TV. Jen McCabe, Matt McCabe, Caitlin, and Brian Jr. and his friends were still there. Julie Nagel's brother came over. She walked out to talk to him and came back in. He says that he was standing by the bay window in the kitchen that overlooks the backyard, and the bulkhead door is under that window. He says he never looked out front. He never heard anything. He didn't know John O'Keefe or Karen Reed were coming over, and they never entered his house. He says that Nicole came up at about 2 a.m. There were no phone calls with Brian Higgins or anyone else, and he fell asleep after 2 a.m. with Chloe in the room. Now, he had also talked about what was behind their fence in the backyard, and I wasn't sure why I needed this information, but you'll see in later testimony why. He said that there was a commuter rail train tracks behind their fence. He said other trains use those tracks. They go by 5-6 times a day, like rush hour, day and night. He said it's loud, but he's immune to the sound, which I'm going to say that is how they're going to say he didn't hear like the emergency vehicles and stuff, because if you can't hear the train, you're not going to hear that. I don't know. Okay, so we were going to get to January 29th. Again, just like his wife, he says he woke up at 6 to 6:30 because Jen McCabe came bursting into the bedroom. Same exact phrasing as his wife. But they didn't coordinate. He said Jen was very upset, almost hysterical, saying John is dead. He didn't know who she was referring to. She makes a reference to going downstairs. He said they had a 1-minute conversation in the bedroom. Jen said the police were downstairs. They went down and Lank was already inside in the foyer. He says that he knew who Lank was, that he knew him to be a Canton police officer. He had met him multiple times and knew him to know his brother Chris. Initially, Lank was alone, but another officer eventually joined. They spoke in the kitchen for 10 to 20 minutes, him, Nicole, Jen, and Matt. He said Lank came back later with Lieutenant Gallagher. He knew who Gallagher was on a professional level. He said they were invited back to the house via a phone call, and they had a 30-minute conversation in the kitchen. Between his initial conversation with Lank and the second conversation, Brian Albert had called Brian Higgins. He said he called him because it was important for him to know what was going on. He says he's not aware of any relationship between Brian Higgins, John O'Keefe, and Karen Reed. He said Brian Higgins mentioned that night that he was friendly with and knew John O'Keefe, and Brian Higgins eventually comes into the house. His sister-in-law, Julie, came over to drop off donuts. He says donuts and coffee for Brian Jr. He saw her in the driveway and asked her to come inside. He told her what happened. He said she was shocked and upset. The second time Canton PD came by, him, Nicole, Jen, Matt, and Brian Higgins, and maybe Julie were there. He said Julie left and came back with Chris after the second time the Canton PD were there. He says he never went out to the scene. He didn't see a reason to go out. Police had already been there, talked to them, told them what was going on. There was a snowstorm. They were trying to do an investigation. He didn't want to interfere. He says he, quote, wanted nothing to do with it. Okay, he talked to Trooper Proctor and Trooper, he says, I don't know his last name, first name, Yuri. So it's Buchnick or Buchanan. He never met Trooper Proctor. He had met Trooper Yuri once or twice before in a professional capacity. He says that he spoke to them at Jen McCabe's house late that morning or early afternoon, the day of the incident. When Jen and Matt left his house, he said Jen was distraught and he wanted to be comforting to them, so he drove to their house. She's like a little sister to him. That's kind of something you want to remember as well. He said that he knew the troopers were going to be there. They were spoken to separately, that he was in the dining room and Jen and Matt were upstairs. And my thinking, which, I don't know, if I'm distraught and I need to be comforted, I have my husband, right? And her and Matt went home together. So why does she need her brother-in-law to come and comfort her? I mean, it may be nothing, but I just found it a little weird. So the key points during cross-examination, he says that he and Brian Higgins never discussed Karen Reed. Brian Higgins never mentioned he'd been texting and flirting with Karen Reed 2 weeks prior to January 28th. I don't think that the defense would bring this up if they don't have receipts, if they don't have some kind of proof that Karen and Brian were texting and flirting. So that remains to be seen. Brian Higgins is due to testify tomorrow, so maybe we'll learn more about that. But that's a little interesting nugget that they dropped there. He says Brian Higgins didn't say anything about John O'Keefe arriving with Karen Reed, and he says he was closer with Brian Higgins than he was to John O'Keefe. Now, regarding prior grand jury testimony, in June of 2023 at the federal grand jury, because the feds are investigating this investigation. He was asked if he knew Karen Reed before January 28th, 2022. He testified that he believed Karen Reed was with John O'Keefe the night he came into Hillside. In April 2022, at the grand jury, the Commonwealth's grand jury, Lally asked him the same question. At that grand jury, he testified, "I've never met or seen her before." Now he says he doesn't recall that statement, and after being shown the transcript, he says, "Maybe once, but I've never had a conversation with her." He actually met Karen Reed and spent several hours with her and John O'Keefe 6 days prior to January 28th, 2022. On January 22nd, 2022, he was at Hillside with Chris Albert, Tim Daly, Julie Albert, Jen McCabe, Matt McCabe, John O'Keefe, and Karen Reed. At 11 p.m. at Hillside, Karen Reed took this photo of Chris, Brian, John, and Tim. At the June 2023 federal grand jury, he testified, "I saw her across the table at Hillside. Didn't really have a conversation." April of 2022, at the Commonwealth grand jury, he was asked if he talked to Karen Reed at Waterfall, and he said, "No, I did not." June 2023, federal grand jury, he was asked the same question. He said, "I did not." So they play the Waterfall surveillance video at 11:53 p.m. on January 28th, 2022. He is looking right at Karen Reed and he's talking. Now, his explanation, let me see. He says he doesn't know if he was talking directly to her. In the video, I mean, I wasn't there, but it really... Sorry. Sorry. Sounds like I have evil demons in my house. It's just the dogs. Like I was saying, in the video, he's looking right at her. And the way I saw the video, I would assume he was talking to her. She's the only one that it looks like he was talking to. But he says he doesn't think the video shows that. I don't know. He says that he thinks that he could have just been, talking to whoever, not necessarily her, but it really looked like he did. His January 29th interview with Trooper Proctor, he said that he did not know Karen Reed. He says that he wasn't trying to distance himself from Karen Reed with that statement. Okay. He says John O'Keefe didn't come into his house on January 29th and that he, quote, "I wish he had." Remember that phrasing. Brian Higgins never gave any indication that he was upset about Karen Reed being with John O'Keefe. Regarding the January 29th statement to Lank, he didn't see any conflict of interest. Even having known Lank a long time, he didn't see a conflict of interest of him giving a statement to Link. He told Link the people at the house that night were Brian Jr., Caitlin, Julie Nagel, and Brian Higgins. Link's statement says he told him Caitlin left at 12:15 a.m. That's the same thing Link's statement from Nicole said. And Nicole said that she didn't say that, it was misinterpreted. He also says he didn't say that. After being shown the report, he says the report is wrong. He never said Caitlin left at 12:15 a.m. He and Nicole never mentioned Colin. He says that's because he left when they got there. He, again, didn't see Colin leave. So all I can figure is Colin put on his invisibility cloak when everyone got there so nobody could see him exit the house. I mean, no one saw this kid leave. Colin wasn't mentioned in the interview with Trooper Proctor at the McCabe's on the 29th at noon. He says that's because he wasn't there for the duration of the night. Which, this is all kind of semantics. I mean, if you're asking who was there, Colin was there when they got home. He was there. So just say, yeah, when we got home, Colin was there, but he left. What's the big deal? And then back to Chloe. He says that she's not great with strangers. It barked. It started barking when it realized there were people downstairs. He thinks she was barking because she needed to go to the bathroom. He let it go out to the bathroom. And then he says, I let it back in. I kind of monitored it a little because we usually don't have people over to the house and the dog's not good with strangers. So I was making sure the dog was all right with the people that were over. Chloe was rehomed in May of 2022. He says that he realized questions were being raised regarding the injuries on John's arm, that they could possibly have been inflicted by a dog. He says John had never been in the house before, so he would in fact have been a stranger to Chloe. And the basement. This mysterious basement. He says there's a weight room and an empty room with water damage from an overflowing toilet. Part of the flooring is ripped up, exposing slab concrete. He says there's mats on the floor by the weights, and a good amount of the floor is exposed concrete. There are 2 sets of stairs to get in the basement. Basically, there's like a little step, and then you turn, and then you go up another set of steps. So you're going up, you turn, and you go up again. He's asked if you could move something large and heavy out of the basement without going through the house by using the bulkhead door, which leads to the backyard. Remember, it's what's under the bay window in the kitchen. This is a picture of the bulkhead doors. And now I'm going to show you a video that was played by the defense, and it's walking from the basement, the bulkhead, going into the backyard and to the flagpole. And I found the video really impactful. You can make of it what you want, but I'm going to play that for you now.
What's in that video. I'll probably play maybe 5 or 10 seconds of it and then pause it. If that's okay.
Okay.
With permission?
Yes.
Pause. Do you recognize what's depicted in that video, at least up to that point?
No.
Okay. Does that look like your basement door, although the bulkhead doors have been replaced different?
The whole thing looks different to me.
Let's go ahead and play the video. Just a second. Pause. Now do you recognize what's depicted in the video?
Yes.
What is that?
So that's was my backyard.
Okay. And what area is over to the left over here?
That's a gate
Okay. And what does that gate open up to?
to the front yard.
So the area that we're looking at right now, where the photographer is standing, is the backyard?
Yes.
Now, having seen that, notwithstanding the way that the bulkhead doors open, now do you recognize what was depicted at the beginning of the video, which was that staircase?
Yes. The downstairs door, the door itself, the wooden door itself, also looks different.
Okay, so, but it is
But it is the stairway. Yes.
going into the basement?
Yes.
Or coming out of the basement?
Yes.
So in other words, another way to put that is, that represented the ingress and egress through the bulkhead to the basement?
Yes.
Okay, let's go ahead and play this. Stop. Did you recognize what was depicted in the video? Bring the lights up. Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. Did you recognize what was depicted in the video as it continued to play?
Yes.
Describe that for the jurors, please.
It looked like the video was from walking from the backyard towards the front yard.
So the video started at the bulkhead door, turned toward the fence, went through the fence, and right up toward the flagpole, correct?
Yes.
Is that an accurate representation of the layout of the house when you lived there on January 28th, 29th, 2022?
Yes.
With the exception of the bulkhead door having been replaced and maybe the basement door?
Yes.
I mean, I think it's compelling. If the defense is right, if something happened to John and it wasn't that Karen Reed hit him with her car, you could easily see someone taking that route and it led right out to where he was found. I mean, maybe it's nothing, but I thought that was huge. Then we have this random voir dire in the middle of his testimony about his phone. So Brian Albert had an iPhone with a number ending in 0888 for several years. The defense filed a motion for production of any cell phones he used between January 28th and February 28th of 2022 and or any data associated with those cell phones, and the hearing was to be held on October 3rd, 2022. Brian Albert was sent a letter stating, quote, "You are hereby placed on notice that these cell phones are the subject of pending litigation and you must not alter, delete, destroy, or in any way manipulate any of these electronic data associated with the cell phones at issue." Brian Albert doesn't remember receiving that document. He says that after he upgraded his phone, then he was told to preserve the phones via a phone call from the DA's office. He says this was a conference call that included Lally, Steve Nelson, who I believe is the victim's advocate, other witnesses, Brian Higgins, Jen McCabe, and Matt McCabe. And during this call, Lally said the defense filed a motion to ask for the phones to be preserved. He did not tell them that he had upgraded his phone and the data was destroyed. He says that he didn't realize his old phone would be factory reset. I mean, when you upgrade your phone and you turn it in, it's got to be wiped in case they resell it so nobody else has your information. And he's a cop for 30 years and he didn't realize that. But that's his story and he's sticking to it. So he says, I wasn't asked, so I didn't tell. Wow. He's a cop. He's a cop. Under oath testimony regarding a conversation with Brian Higgins, he said, I don't recall saying I was going to get rid of my personal phone to Brian Higgins. I may have said that there's personal stuff on my phone, but I don't recall saying that to him. But I don't know. We've had multiple conversations about things, and the judge allows this to come in, which, if you know Aunt Bev, that's huge. So now we're back in court, and we're talking about the phones. So on September 23rd, 2022, the judge ordered Brian Albert to preserve his phones, and Brian Albert says, no, they didn't. So Jackson reads the notice again that was read in voir dire, and on September 23rd or 24th, the Commonwealth stipulates that they did, in fact, send him that letter. So Brian Albert's phone was upgraded and traded in for a new one the third week of September, around the 22nd. How convenient. He says, well, my birthday was September 4th and the phone was broken and failing, so he planned on getting a new phone, and that just happened to be the day he got it. My ass. And this, it just happened, is used a lot in this trial. It's just a coincidence. There's so many coincidences in this trial. So my first question was like, who the hell does he know inside that gave him a heads up like, yo, you need to get rid of your phone? And the 22nd, it just magically is gone. At the June 2023 federal grand jury, they ask him if that was a coincidence, and he says that he doesn't recall that he had had conversations with Brian Higgins, but can't say if Brian Higgins told him he was going to get rid of his phone. He testified that he knew there were conversations with Brian Higgins about the phones, but now he doesn't remember. He knows Brian Higgins got rid of his phone. The butt dials. Now, I made you a graphic because it's a lot. So, hang on, let me get caught up in my notes here. Okay, so picture, if you will, the Brian and Nicole Albert bedroom. They're both in bed. They don't do like most people. They don't charge their phones on the nightstand. As a matter of fact, they weren't charging them that night. And he says they sleep with their phones in the bed because they have 5 kids. I mean, if it's right next to you on the nightstand, you're still going to hear it, but whatever. But on this night, he's in bed with his phone and his reading glasses, and he wasn't charging it that night. And then Nicole comes up and her phone's in the bed, and they're between them. So you've got Nicole, Brian, 2 phones and reading glasses in the bed. He said they might have been on vibrate, but he doesn't know. So that night, Brian Albert called Brian Higgins inadvertently at 2:22 a.m. He says he didn't talk to Brian Higgins between 1:45 and 6 a.m., that it was a butt dial to Brian Higgins. On June 2023, at the federal grand jury, he said that he was hanging out with his wife and butt dialed Brian Higgins at 2:22 a.m. And he's not totally sure how it could have happened because it was inadvertent. In July of 2023, he testified that whatever he said, Jackson didn't say. Jackson put it as an intimate situation with Nicole, but we all know they were getting freaky somehow. I don't want to know. I don't want that image in my head, but that's how he butt dialed Brian Higgins. So he reviews the testimony and he says that yes, he and Nicole were in an intimate situation around that time. So it's not so much a butt dial as a hump dial, which I've never had that happen. I mean, it's hard to make a butt dial these days when the phone locks and you've got to type in a password or use face recognition, and then you got to like push the button and pick the contact that you want to call, and it's a whole thing, but it happened. So he's shown his call records, and January 29th at 2:22 a.m., he called Brian Higgins for 1 second. This is the butt dial. 17 seconds later, also at 2:22 a.m., Brian Higgins called Brian Albert for 22 seconds. Brian Albert says he didn't answer it, so it should be listed as a missed call, but it's not. It's shown that it was answered, and if you miss a call, it should go to voicemail, but there wasn't. So he didn't tell law enforcement that Brian Higgins had called him because he wasn't aware of the call. But there's no voicemail from Brian Higgins, so what's that 22 seconds of connection? He and Brian Higgins did not agree to say those were butt dials. Okay, so now we've got some phone calls that are interesting. So on January 29th at 6:30, he's woke up by Jen McCabe bursting into the room. At 7:20, he calls Brian Higgins. That's the very first call he makes, and they talk for almost 2 minutes. At 7:30, Brian Higgins calls Brian Albert for 5 minutes and 45 seconds. At 7:57, Brian Albert calls Brian Higgins again for 12 minutes and 33 seconds. At 9:40 a.m., Brian Albert calls his brother Kevin for 1 minute and 5 seconds. At 9:50 a.m., Chief Berkowitz calls Brian Albert and leaves a voicemail. At 9:54 a.m., Brian Albert calls Chief Berkowitz back and talks for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. At 11:30 a.m., Brian Albert calls Jen McCabe. At 12:20 p.m., Jen McCabe calls Brian Albert for 7 minutes and 52 seconds. At 2:01 p.m., Brian Albert calls his brother Kevin again, the Canton detective, for 8 minutes. At 6:05, he calls Brian Higgins for 3 minutes and 24 seconds. At 6:12, he calls Higgins again for 1 minute and 7 seconds. At 6:35, he calls Higgins again for 10 minutes and 12 seconds. And then 10 minutes later, at 6:45, he calls his brother Kevin again for 16 minutes. Now, on January 30th, 2022, Brian Albert calls Chief Berkowitz for 1 minute and 6 seconds. On January 31st, at 8:04 p.m., Jen McCabe called Brian Albert. On February 1st, 2022, Chief Berkowitz calls Brian Albert at 1:48 p.m. On February 4th, 2022, at 8:48 a.m., Brian Albert calls Brian Higgins. And I'm like, there's something about that time. So I went back, and on February 4th at 8:50 a.m., 2 minutes after Brian Adams, God, my mind's on music, I guess, Brian Albert calls Brian Higgins, and then 2 minutes later, Gallagher's calling to tell, who was it? One of the other officers to go to 34 Fairview to meet with Chief Berkowitz because he found more evidence. That's when Berkowitz found the pieces of the tail light. So why is Brian Albert calling Brian Higgins right before an officer is dispatched to come to his house because Berkowitz found more evidence? I don't know. I think it's suspicious. I don't like it. He says they were talking about John O'Keefe because of the horrible situation. Many calls were made, but it wasn't to get their story straight. I don't know, guys. What do you think? I at the very least, I smell corruption. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. I really want justice for John O'Keefe and his family. I feel so bad. Those kids lost their mom, their dad, and then their uncle that had taken over raising him. The parents have lost 2 kids and a son-in-law. I want justice for these people, but I want it to be the right person. And if it wasn't Karen Reed, then I don't want her convicted. If there was something more nefarious going on, that family deserves answers. And stuff, the optics are bad. The optics are horrible in this case. The investigation was a complete shit show. And then everybody's connected to everybody. And they're all connected to Jen McCabe. And I don't know, man. I don't know. Still not convinced that Karen Reed murdered John O'Keefe. And I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he was murdered at the Albert house, if there was some kind of accident. I don't know. But if it was just this innocent situation and they're not involved, what's all of this talking with all the different agencies and not wanting to cooperate on certain things and changing your story and changing your testimony? Because Mark Twain said, the truth never changes. So if you're telling the truth, your story should never change. And you shouldn't constantly have to review your testimony to know what you said, because you'd be saying the same thing every single time. But that's just my opinion. I want yours. Pop off in my comments. Tell me what you're thinking. What do you make of the call to Higgins right before the call is made for someone to come to 34 Fairview to find evidence that Berkowitz found? Let me know what you think. Like I said, I'm trying to come at it as a juror, and I'm not convinced yet. I don't see anything that has been presented so far that says Karen Reed murdered this man. But please give this a like. It's really important. It helps the channel a lot. It gets us up in the algorithm on YouTube. Subscribe if you aren't already. And it's free to like, it's free to subscribe, and it would mean so much to me to have all of you continue to join us and join this discussion. So, like, share, comment, and as always, I will see you all in the next one. Bye.